Imagine this. You wake up, not to the blare of an alarm clock, but to the biting chill seeping up from a dirt floor. There's no flicking a switch for light. The sun hasn't even bothered to show up yet. And that grunting sound? Yeah, that's the family pig, your semi-permanent roommate, stirring in the corner of your single-room hut. No electricity, no running water, no comfy mattress. Your entire day, in fact your entire life, is dictated by the rhythm of the sun and the turning of the seasons. For us, it's a thought experiment. For around 90% of the population in medieval Europe, this wasn't imagination. This was just Tuesday. Now, to really get a handle on their daily grind, we need to understand the system they lived under. Feudalism, and more specifically for our peasant, the manorial system. Think of a manor as a large estate, controlled by a lord. The peasants living there weren't usually slaves, but many were serfs tied to the land. They worked the lord's personal fields, his domain, for a set number of days a week. This was called corvée labor. On top of that, they paid rent, often not in cash, but in a share of whatever they grew on their own small strips of land. Or perhaps with chickens, eggs, or other goods. It was a life of obligation, where the fruits of their endless labor largely supported those above them. So with that framework in mind, let's step into their worn-out leather shoes, or more likely their bare feet, and see what the very start of their day looked like. Dawn wasn't just a time of day for a medieval peasant, it was a command. Long before the sun properly crested the horizon, the day's work was calling. There were no snooze buttons here, just the gnawing chill and the sounds of the household, and often the livestock, coming to life. So what was this home they were waking up in? Forget charming country cottages. The typical peasant hut, especially for a serf, was a pretty rudimentary affair. We're often talking about a single-room dwelling, perhaps built around a curved timber frame, what's known as a cruck house. The walls were commonly wattle and daub, a woven lattice of wooden strips or wattle, daubed with a sticky mix of wet soil, clay, sand, animal dung, and straw. The roof would be thickly thatched with reeds or straw, good for insulation but also a haven for insects and vermin. Inside it was dark. Windows, if they existed at all, were small, unglazed openings, maybe covered with wooden shutters or oiled animal skins to keep out the worst of the weather, but letting in precious little light. The floor? Beaten earth, or perhaps dung mixed with straw, packed down hard. Furniture was absolutely minimal. A rough trestle table that could be dismantled, a few benches or stools, and a wooden chest to store their few valuable possessions like spare clothes or tools. And remember that pig we mentioned? It wasn't unusual for families to share their cramped living space with their chickens, pigs, or even a calf, especially in winter. The animals provided a bit of extra warmth, and keeping them inside offered some protection from theft or predators. Privacy, as you can imagine, was a non-existent concept. So you're awake. What next? Hygiene was basic, to say the least. If you were near a stream or had a well, you might splash some cold water on your face and hands. Soap, as we know it, was a luxury far beyond their reach. Teeth? Maybe a rub with a twig or a cloth, if anything. Getting dressed was straightforward. For men, it would typically be braise, sort of loose linen undershorts, followed by a long tunic made of coarse wool or linen, perhaps belted at the waist. Women wore a similar long tunic or gown, called a kirtle. Depending on the weather and their wealth, they might have simple leather shoes, but going barefoot, especially in summer, was common. These clothes were worn day in, day out, often until they literally fell apart. And breakfast? Don't picture a spread. The first meal of the day, if you could even call it that, was often meager and designed purely for fuel. It might be some leftover pottage from the night before. This was the absolute staple, a kind of thick vegetable and grain stew that was kept simmering over the fire almost constantly. Perhaps there was a hunk of coarse dark bread made from rye or barley. Wheat was for the wealthy. To wash it down? Water, or more likely, weak ale. Ale was actually safer than water much of the time, and the brewing process killed off some bacteria, plus it provided extra calories. While the woman of the house rekindled the fire and saw to the immediate needs of any young children, the men and older boys would be making ready for the fields. Tools would be gathered, and any livestock that needed to be taken out would be prepared. Every able-bodied member of the family had their role, from the youngest child capable of scaring birds from crops, to the oldest who could still mend a net or spin wool. The day had begun, and it promised to be long and laborious. With the first light painting the sky, the peasants headed out. Their workday wasn't a neat 9 to 5. It stretched from sunup to sundown. Every precious moment of daylight, especially during the longer summer days, was dedicated to toil. This wasn't work for personal profit, not primarily. A significant chunk of their energy went into cultivating the Lord's personal land, the demand, as part of their feudal obligations. Only after that, or on designated days, could they tend to their own narrow strips of land, scattered across the village's open fields. The tools they used were basic, often made of wood, though iron tips for plowshares or blades for sickles and scythes were becoming more common, if expensive. These tools might be their own, painstakingly maintained, or sometimes provided by the manor, especially for communal tasks like plowing with the Lord's heavy plow. Their existence was a relentless cycle, dictated not by clocks or calendars, but by the immutable rhythm of the seasons. Each brought its own unique set of tasks, its own challenges, and its own anxieties. Let's start with spring. As winter's icy grip finally loosened and the land began to thaw, a new wave of intense labor began. The most crucial task was plowing. This wasn't a gentle till. Medieval plows, especially the heavy wheeled plows, pulled by teams of 8 oxen, were hefty beasts designed to turn over dense, clay-rich European soil. Oxen were favored for their strength and endurance, though horses were faster if the peasant or lord could afford them. Often, plowing was a communal effort, neighbors pooling their animals and strength. It was slow, arduous, back-breaking work, turning the cold earth in preparation for new life. Once plowed, the fields were sown. Seed was broadcast by hand, a skill in itself to get an even spread. This was a time of hope, but also deep anxiety. Would the seeds take? Would there be enough rain? But not too much. While the men focused on the main arable crops, wheat, rye, barley, oats, women would be busy in their own small garden plots or curtilages, usually near the hut. Here they grew vegetables like onions, leeks, peas, beans, and cabbages, vital supplements to the family diet. They'd also be tending to poultry, mending fences around their plots, or clearing drainage ditches. And spring often brought a grim companion, the hunger gap. The previous year's stores would be dwindling, sometimes alarmingly low, while the new crops were still weeks or months from harvest. These were the hungry months, where every scrap of food was precious, and the threat of starvation was very real if the previous harvest had been poor or winter particularly harsh. Then came summer. The long, warm days of summer meant even longer hours in the fields. The crops, now growing vigorously, needed constant attention. Weeding was a relentless, tedious task, often done by women and children, stooping for hours under the hot sun to pull out invasive plants that would choke the precious grain. But the major event of early to midsummer was haymaking. Grass from the meadows, essential for feeding livestock through the coming winter, had to be cut at its peak. This involved scything, a rhythmic, physically demanding job, followed by raking the cut grass into rows, turning it to dry in the sun, and finally gathering it into haycocks or large stacks. Everyone in the village who could wield a rake or pitchfork was involved. Elsewhere, sheep would be sheared for their valuable wool. Women continued their dairy work, milking cows or goats, making cheese and butter, vital sources of protein and fat. They might also spend time foraging in woods and hedgerows for wild berries, nuts, and herbs, supplementing the diet, and perhaps gathering medicinal plants. The sun beat down, the work was hot and dusty, and the days stretched on seemingly forever. And then, the climax of the agricultural year, autumn and the harvest. This was it. Most critical, labor-intensive, and anxious time of the entire year. A successful harvest meant survival through the winter. A poor one spelled potential disaster, hunger, disease, even starvation. The main grain crops, wheat, rye, barley, ripened under the late summer sun, and as soon as they were ready, the entire community mobilized. Reaping was done with sickles, a curved blade that required bending low and cutting stalk by stalk. It was agonizingly slow and utterly exhausting. Speed was essential, as ripe grain could be lost to rain, wind, or birds. Once cut, the grain was tied into sheaves and left in the fields in stooks to dry completely. Then it was carted to the Lord's barn, or the peasant's own small storage space. But the work wasn't over. The grain kernels had to be separated from the stalks and husks. This was done by threshing, usually with a tool called a flail, 2 pieces of wood, joined by a leather thong, repeatedly beating the sheaves on a hard floor. Then came winnowing, where the threshed grain was tossed into the air, allowing the wind, or a draft from a winnowing fan, to carry away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier grain behind. Finally, the precious grain had to be milled into flour. This usually meant taking it to the Lord's mill, be it a watermill or a windmill, for which the peasant had to pay a portion of their grain, known as a multure. It was a monopoly, and often a source of resentment. Autumn was also the time for slaughtering excess livestock. Pigs were especially important, as there wouldn't be enough fodder to keep them all through winter. The meat would be preserved by salting, smoking, or drying. Vegetables were harvested from garden plots and stored. Everything was geared towards preparing for the lean months ahead. Finally, winter descended. The shorter days and harsh weather of winter brought a change of pace, but not necessarily rest. Outdoor agricultural work largely ceased, but other essential tasks took over. Caring for the animals that had been kept, feeding them, ensuring they had shelter, was a daily chore. Firewood was crucial for heating and cooking, so men would spend cold days cutting timber and gathering fallen branches, though they had to be careful, as forests were often strictly controlled by the Lord, with severe penalties for poaching wood or game. Tools that had been battered during the year needed repairing or replacing: handles for plows, teeth for rakes. For women, winter often meant more indoor work, endless hours of spinning wool or flax into thread using a drop spindle, and then weaving that thread into coarse cloth for clothing or blankets on a simple loom. It was a time for mending clothes, making candles from animal fat, and, of course, childcare. While there was perhaps more time spent indoors, huddled around the smoky fire for warmth, the cold and damp were pervasive. Darkness fell early, and the nights were long. This was also a time for storytelling, for passing on traditions and local lore, a brief respite from the physical demands, but the constant awareness of their food stores and the hope that they would last until spring was never far away. The cycle was complete, only to begin anew with the first signs of thaw. So after all that back-breaking labor, what did a medieval peasant actually eat? We've mentioned pottage a few times, and it truly was the cornerstone of their diet. Think of it as a perpetually simmering stew or thick soup. Its ingredients varied by season and availability, but typically included grains like oats, barley, or rye, along with whatever vegetables were on hand from their garden plot. Onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, parsnips, peas, and beans were common. Sometimes a scrap of bacon or a bone might be thrown in for flavor, but meat was a rarity. This pot often just sat by the fire, with new ingredients added as old ones were consumed. Bread was the other absolute staple, the staff of life. But this wasn't the soft, white loaf we might imagine. Peasant bread was usually dark, dense, and coarse, made from rye, barley, or a mix of grains called maslin. Wheat bread was generally for the lord of the manor, or for special occasions like communion. Their small garden plots, the curtilages we mentioned, were crucial for supplementing the pottage and bread with fresh greens, herbs, and root vegetables. Apples, pears, and wild berries, when in season, offered a touch of sweetness. What about protein? Well, cheese and eggs from their own chickens or those belonging to the manor provided some. If they were lucky enough to own a pig, its slaughter in autumn meant a precious supply of pork, preserved through salting or smoking, to last through the winter. Other meat, like beef or mutton, was rare, usually only eaten on feast days, or if an animal died unexpectedly. Hunting game like deer or boar in the Lord's forest was strictly forbidden. Poaching carried severe punishments, even death, but desperate peasants sometimes took the risk. If they lived near a river or lake, fish might supplement their diet, though fishing rights often belonged to the Lord too. To drink? As we said, ale was incredibly common, often weak small beer, but it was generally safer than water, which could be easily contaminated, and it provided valuable calories. Clean water sources were vital, but not always guaranteed. Wine was a luxury almost entirely out of reach for the average peasant. They preserved food through salting, smoking, drying, and pickling, essential techniques in a world without refrigeration. Now let's talk about something that was a constant shadow over peasant life: health and mortality. Life was fragile, and death was an ever-present reality. Malnutrition was common, weakening their immune systems and making them susceptible to diseases. Poor sanitation was a huge factor. With no proper sewage systems, human and animal waste often contaminated water sources and living areas, leading to outbreaks of dysentery and other waterborne illnesses. Respiratory problems from smoky, damp huts were rife. Injuries from hard physical labor, often untended or poorly treated, could easily become infected and fatal. Medical care as we understand it didn't exist for peasants. While there were university-trained physicians, they were expensive and served the wealthy. Peasants relied on folk remedies, herbal concoctions passed down through generations, and the skills of the local wise woman or herbalist. Sometimes these remedies worked, sometimes they didn't. Practices like bloodletting were common for a wide range of ailments, often doing more harm than good. Infant and child mortality rates were heartbreakingly high. Many children didn't survive past their 5th birthday. If you did make it through childhood, you might live into your 50s or 60s, assuming you weren't struck down by famine, plague, or accident. And of course, events like the Black Death in the mid-14th century were catastrophic, wiping out vast swaths of the population. Yet, despite these immense hardships, peasant life wasn't solely about suffering. There was a strong sense of community and faith that bound them together. The church was the absolute center of village life, both spiritually and socially. Attending Mass on Sundays and holy days was usually compulsory. The church building itself was often the most substantial structure in the village, a place for baptisms, marriages, and funerals, the key rites of passage that marked a peasant's journey through life. The local priest, though sometimes as poor and uneducated as his flock, was a figure of authority and a conduit to the divine. And then there were the holy days, which is where our word holiday comes from. These were eagerly anticipated breaks from the relentless toil. Major festivals like Christmas, which lasted 12 days, Easter, Whitsun, May Day, and Lammas, the harvest festival, were times for feasting, as much as their means allowed, drinking, dancing, singing, and playing games like wrestling or archery. These celebrations, often blending Christian traditions with much older pagan customs, provided vital social cohesion and a release from daily pressures. Superstition also ran deep, often intertwined with their Christian faith. Belief in charms, omens, fairies, and the power of curses or blessings was widespread. The local alehouse, if the village had one, served as an important social hub, especially for men, a place to exchange news, gossip, and share a drink after a hard day's work. Despite the hierarchy and the hardships, villages were close-knit communities. People depended on each other for survival, for help with the harvest, for support in times of crisis, for the simple human need for connection. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the peasants would finally trudge home from the fields or their various tasks. Their bodies ached, their energy was spent, but there were still a few more things to do before sleep could claim them. The evening meal would be much like the first. More pottage, perhaps some bread, maybe a bit of cheese if they were lucky. It was eaten in the dim, smoky interior of their hut, illuminated by the glow of the central hearth. If they could afford it, a rushlight, a reed dipped in animal fat, might provide a feeble, flickering light, but tallow candles were a luxury. Artificial light was precious and used sparingly. There wasn't much leisure time as we know it. Evenings might be spent on small, essential tasks, men mending tools or sharpening blades by the firelight, women continuing their endless spinning of wool or flax, or mending torn clothing. For children, if they weren't already exhausted and asleep, this might be a time for an elder to tell stories. Tales of local legends, saints, or heroic deeds passed down through oral tradition. There was little privacy, little personal space, just the shared existence within those four walls. And then, sleep. Not in a comfortable bed, but on a straw pallet laid directly on the dirt floor, perhaps with a rough woolen blanket for warmth. The fire would be banked for the night, and the family would huddle together, exhausted from the day's labor, ready to do it all again when the first hint of dawn returned. So what can we take away from this glimpse into the daily life of a medieval peasant? It's undeniable that their existence was one of relentless hard work, constant vulnerability to the whims of weather, the ever-present threat of famine and disease, and severely limited personal freedom. They were bound by a rigid social structure, owing service and produce to their lord, tithes to the church, and often facing arbitrary justice. Their world was small, typically confined to their village and the surrounding lands. Their horizons were, in many ways, as limited as the light in their huts. Yet it's crucial not to see them solely as passive victims. They were incredibly resourceful, intimately connected to the land and the cycles of nature in a way we can barely comprehend today. They possessed a deep well of practical knowledge and skills. They built communities, found ways to celebrate, supported each other, and demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. They endured, they adapted, they passed on life and traditions. And let's not forget, these were the people, the vast, overwhelming majority, whose labor was the very engine of the medieval economy. Their sweat and toil built the castles, fed the knights, and supported the clergy. They were the foundation upon which the entire medieval world stood. What aspect of medieval peasant life surprised you the most? Or what do you find most compelling? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this journey into the past has given you some food for thought, please do give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell so you don't miss our next historical deep dive. Thanks so much for watching.